Great. Okay, let's begin. Hi, everyone. My name is Nathan Thompson. I'm the Senior Managing Editor of the Journal on Education in Emergencies, or JEiE. Thank you for joining this webinar, which marks the publication of our latest issue, JEiE Volume 9, Number 1. The purpose of this webinar is to highlight the phenomenal work of the authors whose research and fieldwork was published in the recent issue. Over the next 90 minutes, we'll hear brief presentations on the new findings and evidence encapsulated in the issue and provide plenty of time for presenters to take audience members' questions. All of the articles we discussed today, and indeed Volume 9 in its entirety, are available free of charge from the INEE website. I encourage you to follow the links our managing editor, Samantha Colon, will provide in the webinar chat to download and read these timely articles. I would like to take a moment now to introduce JEiE's editor-in-chief, Dr. Dana Birdie, who will put our work on this issue into broader context. Dana Birdie is Associate Professor and Director of International Education at New York University's Department of Applied Statistics, Social Science, and Humanities, and Associated Faculty at NYU's Politics Department, NYU Abu Dhabi, and NYU's Center for Practice and Research at the Intersection of Information, Society, and Methodology, or PRISM. She is also a faculty fellow at the Association for Analytic Learning about Islam and Muslim Societies. Her research focuses on education, peace, and conflict, and has been funded by a number of international and domestic funders. Her book, Schools for Conflict or for Peace in Afghanistan, won the 2017 Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order. Dana, over to you.
Thank you so much, Nate, and wonderful to see everyone here today. I'm so thrilled to see the launch of our next issue. Welcome to our official launch of JEiE Volume 9, Number 1. Before discussing this issue, I'd like to tell you a little bit about our work at the Journal, which might be familiar to some of you who are familiar with the work already. Many of you know about the Journal, but what you may not realize is that we maintain an entirely open access model of publication. At the same time, we adhere to rigorous academic standards. This means that the contents of the journal are accessible and free to all readers everywhere, and we do not charge fees for authors. We don't limit access to authors who are able to raise funds to pay their fees. In other words, we maintain a truly open access model of publishing and promoting equity in the field. Our contributing authors in this issue present evidence that cuts across an array of geographic settings and populations, including the Middle East, South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Asia. In keeping with our priorities, this issue provides actionable data and evidence for researchers, practitioners, school officials, policymakers to improve the learning outcomes of children living in emergency contexts. The rigorous research and our cutting-edge field notes contained in this issue also continue our efforts to support equity, social justice, and locally transformed practice through the production of knowledge and dissemination of evidence for the field. The main themes in this latest publication coalesce around questions that relate to context. As we conduct research, implement programs, make policies, and create frameworks and other documentation, of course, paying attention to context is critically important. So this issue also consolidates attention toward understudied questions and underrepresented voices in education and emergencies, in education emergency scholarship. Specifically, the research articles and field notes presented here in Volume 9 focus on the following, and you'll hear from each of these authors who will talk about each of these pieces. First, key factors that influence whether students resume their education or drop out when shocks disrupt their schooling. Second, the ways remedial education can help out-of-school students resume their education. Third, how locally relevant framing of hope, self-concept, resilience, and vulnerability, these are concepts that are commonly discussed now, both domestically and internationally. I know here domestically in the US, but also very much so internationally. The questions about how these concepts influence students' aspirations and elevate teacher agency. And last, the efficacy of social and emotional learning, those interventions that we also have discussed widely, both domestically and abroad, that respond to students' age and gender-related realities. So disaggregating these effects from social and emotional learning interventions. Given the wealth of recent research that's emerged from our experience with the pandemic, we also, in this issue, we also feature a special subsection on education and pandemics, which contains 4 field notes. These field notes offer lessons for the design and delivery of community-based and distance education, such as, for example, the need for culturally responsive curricula, offline and paper-based modalities in settings where internet and radio-based solutions are not feasible. The benefit of teachers and other education program facilitators visiting students to provide in-person support, investment in teacher training, and flexibility in higher education, as well as the factors that promote system resilience in the face of a pandemic. These, of course, are crucial to us who work in education and emergencies writ large, and we found, particularly during the pandemic, that many around the world focus their attention on suddenly understanding how systems can continue in the face of such crises. Before we give the floor to our speakers, I'd like to briefly thank our journal staff. We wouldn't be here without them. They are just heroic in their efforts to work with all of our authors around the world and all of the publications that we receive and all of the reviewers and the board members of the journal to put together each issue. And they include our editorial assistants, Amina Rotari and Juna Chang, our technical editors, Joao Sotomayor and Kelly Gillespie, and of course, our managing editor, Samantha Colon, and Nathan Thompson, our senior managing editor, without whom none of this would have been possible. I'll pass it back to Nate to introduce the panelists now, the authors' presentations. Go ahead, Nate. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dana. Actually, before I pass it over to our first speaker, I want to provide a brief word on how the remainder of the event will proceed. So we are delighted to bring you 9 speakers today. And given this packed schedule, we've asked each speaker to deliver a 3-minute presentation. And then after each brief presentation, we'll take the opportunity to have the speaker address audience members' questions for a few moments, and then I'll introduce the following speaker, and they'll present, and we'll have Q&A related to their article, and so on and so forth. Our hope is that this will provide a chance for each speaker to receive a question or two and go into greater depth about a facet of their research or fieldwork. And then after the final speaker has received audience questions and answered them, we'll spend any remaining time going back and revisiting questions, dialogue among presenters, or hearing new audience questions that may have come up after, in the midst of hearing the other presentations. So I encourage audience members to please use the Q&A function, which is in the bottom ribbon of this webinar screen. You can type your questions in there, but as well, after each presentation, then I'll open it up and facilitate the questions. Leave the questions in the Q&A function or the chat, and we'll try to find them and address those to the appropriate author. Finally, just as a brief reminder to our panelists to help keep us on time, when you see that chat message from Kelly and she turns her camera on, that'll signal that you have about a minute remaining in your presentation. So thank you for helping that way. And then Sam is beginning to share the screen. Yes. With that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, presenting the research article, Impact of Catch-Up Flubs in Conflict-Affected Myanmar, a community-led remedial learning model, is Sylvia Arlini. Sylvia is a research and evaluation specialist at Save the Children International Asia Regional Office, currently located in Singapore. Sylvia, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Nathan. So I'm so delighted to be part of this. So yeah, I'm gonna talk about the Save the Children initiated community-led remedial learning model called Catch-Up Clubs in conflict-affected Myanmar, specifically in Cayenne State and Rakhine states. They are known for the home of ethnic minority Karen and Rakhine and also home of the displaced ethnic Rohingya children in Myanmar. Save the Children are concerned about the protracted learning crisis in the country resulted from the extended school closure during COVID-19 pandemic that has also been compounded by ongoing conflict resulted from the military coup happening in February 2021. Many children aged 10 years old or above unable to read basic foundational literacy equivalent to the grade 2 level, and they are at high risk of dropping out permanently from the school. The objective of this presentation to show you an evidence on how remedial learning initiated by the Save the Children is able to tackle the learning loss, supporting children to improve their foundational literacy and social emotional learning. Catch-up Club is a short-term remedial learning done in a cycle of 13 to 15 weeks. So it uses a play-based literacy learning approach to help children in learning. And also the children are grouped in by the ability rather than age. So following the approach of teaching at the right level. And also it involves the community volunteer to help facilitating the club. So as part of this intervention, we also provide the cash assistance and also child protection support to address the barrier of learning. Next slide, please. The study employed a quasi-experimental design using a mixed methods data collected from the baseline survey and inline survey, as well as the qualitative interview from the focus group discussion with the children, the facilitator, and also the project staff. The results show that it's a promising short-term intensive remedial learning approach where the children participating in the catch-up club improve their literacy and SEL significantly as compared to those not participating in the clubs. Catch-up club were able to complement the current education system to address the learning loss. Based on the qualitative interview finding, we found that children reported gain more self-confidence after joining the club. They enjoy learning without feeling any academic pressures. Also, it also helped build positive education aspiration where the children wanted to continue to higher education. So one of the success of the club were able to harness the community capability through recruiting community facilitator from the local community and organization, and also leveraging the community existing linguistic resources. So we hired the facilitator who are able to speak local language as well as the language of instruction that Burmese in this case. Some lessons learned for improvement of the implementation in the future, of course, can be drawn from the finding on unintended effects, so interfering with the children's ability to attend the learning activities. So overall, it is a success, and then we are able to replicate and adapt it and scale it in the wider context in 9 countries where the Save the Children operating so far in Asia, Latin America, and also Africa. Thank you so much.
Thank
Happy
you,
to take any question. Thanks.
Thank you, Sylvia. Yes, questions related to this research article, please provide in the chat or in the Q&A box that you see there. We have a few moments for questions about the Catch-Up Club's research article. Okay, yes, please continue to put questions in the chat and in the Q&A box. Sylvia, I have a question. Again, you noted in the article and in the presentation as well that one of the effects of the Catch-Up Club's intervention was students feeling more self-confident, more confident in their learning, and they persist through higher levels of their education. What do you think were some of the main features of the intervention, the Catch-Up Clubs, that resulted in those outcomes?
Yeah, I think, thank you so much. So one of the highlight is that what is like said by the children is they say that the activity is so much fun to have this activity is comparing to the conventional learning at school, because this one we use approach of the play-based learning. So before we start the learning activity, we start with some like fun activities, playing. So it's like something like interacting children to build the atmosphere for learning. So children appreciate it so much. So and then there a lot of like the quote from the children that is amazing. They feel that the facilitator pays so much attention. So while at school they feel that the teacher is only paying attention to those who are like academically like good. So for those who are academically is not really good, so they don't really pay attention. While these, they feel like they are like a lot of care from the facilitator, and also it's so much fun. And then the interesting thing as well. So as you know, in the context of especially Kayin states, uh, it is, and also the Rakhine. So actually, the education system, most of the children actually attending like a community-based education or ethnic-based education, right? So because of, if you read the article further, that there is also conflict in that. So that is basically there is no trust in the Myanmar education system. But with this fun learning, children think that they wanted to continue to the formal education, and then because it led to the real opportunity to fulfill their education need, because there is any progression to higher level. So this is like building a self-confidence and also education aspiration to continue further study. It's not only stop at a level, but they wanted to continue further because they find it is fun to learn. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. I see that we have gotten another chat question and one in the Q&A box. So if we have remaining time, let's circle back to those. Although Sylvia, you, I think, are able to type an answer in the Q&A box to Stephanie's question about the benchmarks that catch-up clubs use to measure success. So I'm going to move on and introduce our next speaker. Next, Rena Dietz will present the research article Addressing Adolescence, Advocating for Age and Gender Responsive Social and Emotional Learning During Emergencies. Rena is a PhD candidate at New York University, currently located in New York. Over to you, Rena. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Nate. And thanks to everyone for being here this morning or evening, whatever time it may be for you. My co-author, Hedy Lachman, is sad to not be here today, but I'm presenting sort of on both of our behalf. So our motivation, and the reason I start with motivation is because this study was a systematic review, and we initially conducted a full systematic review of social emotional learning interventions across development and humanitarian contexts, and noticed that there may be a trend. So we dug a little bit deeper and refocused a systematic review specifically on adolescence and looking at age and gender responsive social emotional learning. So we specifically focused on this because despite a rise in social emotional learning, there is still a lack of focus on adolescence and really on research looking at the effects of social emotional learning on adolescence. Despite this being a period of great gendered socialization, and it's even been referred to as a window of opportunity for social emotional development. During this developmental period, the effects of adversity are great, but there's also an opportunity to address these effects in real time. And coping mechanisms and social emotional skills that are learned in adolescence really do continue on into adulthood. So this is a very important time for us to understand the effects of conflict on adolescence. And as many of us here today know, conflict has uniquely gendered effects across boys and girls. Often, though not always, adolescent boys are expected to take on new roles as head of the household or enter into armed combat. And adolescent girls are often find that their worlds contract and they may be confined to the home sphere for safety or required to work to make up for lost income. And we expected to find that these unique stressors on adolescents and their gendered experiences would lead them to have different or varied experiences of social emotional learning interventions, and thus leading to potentially different outcomes. So next slide. We did find that among adolescents, girls tended to see greater social gains and boys saw greater gains in emotional outcomes. And we expect that these differences may be a result of their differing experiences of conflict and how the interventions do or don't address those issues. So while girls may have fewer social opportunities, this social emotional learning program may be their only opportunity to socialize and to develop these social skills. And for boys, in many conflict-affected contexts, they may be told to repress their emotions and simultaneously expected to take on more roles and responsibilities. And the intervention may provide a necessary opportunity for each of their respective needs. Interestingly, we found that as adolescents age, they tend to have fewer positive effects, and in some cases, even unintended negative effects. So this is very important for us to focus on in future programming and research. And speaking of these differences as they transition into adulthood, SEL programs that did not address the structural issues and root causes of the crisis did not achieve their intended social, emotional, or broader economic or academic outcomes. But those that did address specifically these structural issues facing adolescents did have promising effects. And these findings are super important to inform future programming to support adolescent girls, boys, and non-binary young people. And future research and programming should consider the uniquely gendered experiences of conflict and social emotional development that takes place in adolescence, and intentionally target and study approaches responding to these needs, since they do have promising effects. We find that additional research is specifically necessary to first understand the uniquely gendered experiences and obstacles and how they affect adolescents' needs, and how social emotional learning interventions can be most effective for improving adolescent social emotional skills, well-being, academic, and livelihood outcomes. I'll turn it over to any questions.
Thanks, Rena. Wonderful presentation. Yes, please, the audience members, please put your questions in the Q&A function or in the chat. Or if there's any other presenters on the call who would like to pose a question. Okay, I do have a question that has come through. This is from YY Han in the chat. Is it because of age or because of program that older adolescents have negative social and emotional learning outcomes?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question. And we were specifically looking at causal studies. So it is not just as they get older, they have more negative social emotional outcomes, though that may be also true. I don't have the information to the data to actually answer that question, but it was actually because of the program. So compared to control adolescents who were not receiving the program, those who participated in the program had some negative outcomes. And to clarify, this was not that every program had negative outcomes, but rather there were there were some indications in some programs that there were specific negative outcomes. So this was not, that every SEL program had led to negative outcomes, but rather that when gender and age were not addressed, there were some negative outcomes in terms of hope, for example, as well as some negative livelihoods outcomes. And Nate, I think you are muted.
Yeah, thanks, Rena. This is great. I'm seeing a lot more questions come through in the Q&A function. I know that these can be answered with chat responses in real time. So Rena, I'd encourage you to open up that dialogue.
Yes.
With those, and the authors' names are recorded here, so we can make those connections after the fact too.
I'd be happy to answer any more questions through follow-up.
Great, thank you. Okay, great. Presenting the research article Further Left Behind After the COVID-19 School Closures, Survey Evidence on Rohingya Refugees and Host Communities in Bangladesh is Gudrun Østby. Gudrun is a research professor at the Peace Research Institute Oslo and deputy editor at the Journal of Peace Research. She is currently located in Oslo. Gudrun, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Nathan. So this is joint work with colleagues here from the Peace Research Institute and Cornell University, and it comes out of a project funded by the Research Council of Norway on how to improve education for Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. So very briefly on our motivation. So this is probably known to most of you, but the school closures stemming from the COVID-19 pandemic led to the largest disruption of education in history, affecting nearly 1.6 billion learners worldwide. And Bangladesh had one of the longest school closures in the world, with about 82 weeks of full closure between March 2020 and March 2022. Now, in this paper, we explore the impact of the COVID-19 closures of schools and learning centers on dropout rates, that is, not returning to educational services, among one of the most vulnerable groups in the world, namely the Rohingya refugees in Cox's Bazar refugee camps in Bangladesh. In doing so, we compare the refugees' educational experiences with those of the immediate local population. Even before the pandemic, the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh were facing an education crisis, as the Bangladeshi government forbids unregistered Rohingya refugees from accessing the country's public schools. And instead, UNICEF and international NGOs provide non-formal education through informal learning centers in the camps. Drawing on past research on the educational effects of the Ebola epidemic in West Africa, we postulated a decline across all types of education services due to the pandemic. And additionally, previous literature highlights how refugees and girls in particular are typically disproportionately disadvantaged during crisis in general. And as summarized in this figure, we expect the largest dropout rate then among refugees and among females, and with the biggest impact on female refugees and especially teenage refugee girls, given high rates of, for example, child marriage and pregnancy in secondary school girls in the country. Next slide, please. Okay, so we conducted a set of phone surveys, both during the school closure and after the first reopening in November 2021 in Cox's Bazar, to explore the impact of the closures of schools and learning centers on the usage of these different educational services among both the refugees and the host community children. While we did not find clear evidence that the pandemic led to a general overall decline in the use of education services, we did identify a very significant detrimental impact of the closure of the educational services on the attendance of teenage refugee girls after the reopening of the learning centers in the camps. So overall, our results align with studies from the Ebola epidemic. That is, the pandemic did lead to increased systematic educational inequalities. And when we ask caregivers about reasons why their girls did not return to school, The answer is suggested that this was mainly due to security concerns and also family obligations. And this all underscores the need to develop and evaluate interventions aimed at improving educational attendance among young women and young refugee women in particular. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Gudrun. Excellent piece, yes. Great. Any questions in the chat or in the QA, please? Okay, I'll jump in with a question, Gudrun. What can formal education systems or non-formal education providers like INGOs or UN agencies operating in the area do during or before school closures to make schooling, make return to schooling after a disruption more likely?
What did they do to make it more likely?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so first of all, it's important, I think, to clarify that the informal schooling services are distinguished between these learning centers that are run by the NGOs, but then there are also these grassroots education systems that the refugees provide themselves. But due to restrictions, these are not legal anymore. So it's been quite challenging especially for the girls who have had big challenges returning to the learning centers. Now, UNICEF and other NGOs have worked really hard to sort of disseminate and encourage girls to return, but still we see a significant drop. So it's been a real challenge on the ground to get the girls back to the learning centers.
Thank you. And just taking a question from the chat here from one of our other presenters today, Chris Henderson. How large was your sample, and how did you navigate that, and how did you get to that sample given the government's restrictions on phone usage among Rohingya populations?
So this, how much time do you have? This is a long story because this study was planned before the pandemic, and we had planned a much larger physical survey, which was tested and piloted and ready to take place in March 2020. And then the pandemic hit. So we had to turn around and completely redesign everything. So that's why we ended up with a phone service where we have about 600 respondents, 300 from the refugee community and 300 from the host community. Now this builds on a sample from a Yale study that was conducted a couple of years before. So we were lucky to use their sampling frame. Finally, in June 2022, we were able to do an in-person follow-up survey with a slightly larger sample, but trying to revisit as many as possible of those 600 original respondents.
Thank you, Gudrun. I know that adapting research plans was something that faced so many JEiE authors and of course so many in EIE as the pandemic fell. Thank you again for your presentation. Next, presenting his research article, Hoping Against the Odds, Understanding Refugee Youth's Aspirations for Gaining Overseas Scholarships, is Hassan Aden. Hassan is a senior researcher at the Peace Research Institute, Oslo, typically based in Oslo, but I believe currently in Dadaab. Hassan, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Nathan. Good afternoon, everyone. It's actually a great pleasure to join you today for the launch of Volume 9 and number 1. The article titled Hoping Against the Odds, Understanding Refugee Youth's Aspirations for Gaining Overseas Scholarships builds on an empirical observation that most of the high school students in Dadaab camps, whether they are performing well or not, pursue overseas scholarship programs, such as WUSC programs in earnest. I asked the question, why do young refugees in the Dadaab camps of Kenya aspire to gain resettlement-based scholarships for tertiary education when the odds of getting one is minimal? I present 3 explanations to this question. First, refugee youth believe that success in education will grant them an exit license from the confines of the camps. And most of the students I have spoken with describe life in the camps as humiliating, not having a good future, and not being free. Second, students hope that receiving scholarships will give them opportunities to access a good quality tertiary education and the chance to pursue their desired career, and that overseas scholarships will put them on the pathway to translate their acquired knowledge and skills into meaningful economic value. Third, students believe that by working hard to get a good grade on the KN certificate secondary education exams and being motivated by their dreams of overseas tertiary education, their chances of getting local tertiary education opportunities that require lower grades will improve. So these findings have several implications. First, the high aspiration of young refugees notwithstanding, in reality, most of the students often fail to achieve the eligibility grades for the overseas scholarships due to structural challenges affecting access to good quality learning and resources. Additionally, the overseas scholarships are also highly competitive, and that at times, even those who qualify may not get one. Second, despite the structural limitations, the cultural belief in education as a pathway to prosperity and the emphasis on hard work and determination as the key to success against all odds drives young refugees' hope in education. Third, the capacity of young refugees to pursue lofty educational goals is a strength and not weaknesses, because through this endeavor, they can gain crucial skill sets such as effective planning, risk management, coping skills, and strong resilience. Second slide, please. The history of young people in the Dadaab camps and their educational aspirations suggests 2 extreme ends and the double-edged effects of having a high hope in education. At the completion of secondary school, one might find a phenomenal success that defies the odds, while in another case, one might experience an extreme failure, which can lead to hopelessness, depression, and suicidal thoughts. However, these are 2 extreme and rare cases, and most of the students often find themselves in the middle at the end of secondary school journey. In conclusion, it is crucial that structural and cultural constraints do not block these young people's hope in education. Additionally, it's also important to create a dedicated program that provides young refugees with psychosocial support and also to create more structural opportunities so that they can succeed in and through education. With that, I thank you.
Thank you, Hassan. That's great. Yeah, very, very pleased to hear about your research on this topic. Let me review the Q&A and the chat. Please provide your questions for Hassan. Okay, how about a question from me? Great. I want to go back to the idea of the double-edged sword, of course, either great success or having hopes dashed and the psychological pain that can come from that. What does a good mental health support and psychosocial support system look like for students in Dadaab who are pursuing higher education? What would something like that look like or entail? Or what exists?
Actually, there's no such kind of support at the moment, as far as I know. Most of the students, most of the schools rely basically on school counselors who are not trained to provide the necessary support that the students require. So, and I think that's something that we need to push for, at least so that such kind of structures are created. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult for those young people to have, hope in education and not get the necessary support that they require in the event that they fail to that such kind of hope fails to materialize. And as I have noted at the end of the article, there was even some serious cases of suicide, happening as a result of failure to achieve the expected grades in the national exams. So I think it is very critical situation, and the world and everyone who's interested in supporting those young refugees, I think would have to take that seriously.
Okay, thank you again for that response. And I see that there's a question in the chat for you, Hassan, about your work from Mirko. I wonder if you can take that question in the chat and provide an answer there, because I just want to keep us to our time and move on to our next presenter. Thanks for the question as well. Okay. All right, next, presenting his research article, Bangkit Semangat, Raise the Spirits, Teachers' Vulnerability, Resilience, and Voice in Post-Disaster Indonesia, is Chris Henderson. Chris is a doctoral fellow at Teachers College, Columbia University, and currently located in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh. Over to you, Chris.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Nate, and thanks to all my colleagues who have preceded me. I wrote this article really in response to the 2022 Transforming Education Summit, which I was involved with, and particularly the recommendation for improved social dialogue between teachers, state actors, development partners, and really the larger question of whether or not systems are even in place to meaningfully include teachers in policymaking and decision processes. So although scholars such as Jackie Kirk, Mary Mendenhall, and Sarah Dryden Peterson have long incorporated teacher voices to highlight teachers' voices, their development needs, and their wellbeing challenges, teachers have been comparatively absent in policy advocacy and in much of the technical guidance that really determines the nature of their work in crisis contexts. So in this article, as a proxy for teachers' own positionality, my work really critiques the positioning of survivors of conflict and environmental disasters by humanitarian and development actors. And even though, to an extent, assets or strengths-based approaches are now more a part of technical guidance, the recommendations that we make about teachers and for teachers are really still oriented by Western norms in these guidance notes. And many of these guidance notes still position survivors of conflict and disaster as victims. So as Mike Weshells claims, this really is an appellation that defines survivors as helpless and often creates a self-fulfilling prophecy within the humanitarian ecosystem. So in this sense, I really want to lean on Mahazeni's statement to inform my own research approach, and that it's necessary to look at survivors as not merely affected people, but as subjects with their own cultures and with their own coping strategies. Next slide, please. So fieldwork for this paper in particular took place in 2016 and relates to the 2006 Yogyakarta earthquake in Indonesia, which claimed close to 6,000 lives. And I'm going to skip over the context element here, but I put it in here really just to remind the audience that all emergencies happen within a much broader social and political spectrum, which obviously impacts the way people experience a crisis. But really what I want to achieve with this paper is to borrow from Cauchy-Maltese term and present a subaltern epistemic position. And really to do this in terms of my methods, I learned from the South Pacific method of Talanoa to conduct teacher interviews. And I facilitated teacher interviews in the Indonesian language and used the Indonesian term or the Javanese term ngobrol to define our meetings and really allow for a more fluid and unstructured exploration of 5 teachers' experiences through conversations in a relaxed environment of the teacher's choosing. And these conversations were really to explore teachers' own framings of their work and experiences after a disaster. And in my research, as those who've read the article will see, I really stress to use Indonesian concepts to define the findings. And I want to highlight that a concept that appeared time and again through the ngobrol-ngobrol is that of Bangkit Semangat, which loosely translates to raise the spirits. And in my final minute, I'll just quickly sum up what that Bunkitsamunga term means and why I think it's important. It's this idea that none of the teachers saw themselves as victims or especially vulnerable, and they didn't really consider themselves to be resilient either in the Western sense. What they did see, however, is that their role was as providers of communal support, and that idea of Bunkitsamunga, or to raise their own spirits and the spirits of each other, was really their task as teachers in the disaster recovery context. And in terms of their teaching, Bunkitsamunga really allowed them to provide a disaster-sensitive approach to learning. And so finally, just in terms of the implications of this research on humanitarian policy and practice, I really advocate for the inclusion of state-level actors and teachers' voices in policy guidance, and specifically some of these more locally or grounded terms and particularly different languages in the way in which we conceptualize teachers' experiences in post-disaster context. So I think I'm out of time. I'll leave that there, and yeah, thanks once again for this opportunity.
Thanks, Chris. Yes, super interesting piece. Thank you for this presentation. I'm really appreciating seeing the questions come in through the question and answer thing on the webinar. And again, I know that this is a fast turnaround time to have your questions answered. So I'm hoping that we'll have some time at the end to continue to talk about these important themes. Okay, I'm just reading the question provided in the chat from Amy Parker. Super interesting, Chris. Yes, seconded. Thanks, Amy. Do you think teachers' unions provide a culturally grounded platform to represent teachers?
Great question. In this particular context, no. And as my article kind of goes into, the experience of this disaster happens soon after the fall of Suharto, the dictator. And during Suharto's time, teachers were really functionaries of the state. And teacher unions didn't have as much of a strong role within the Indonesian education ecosystem. And so even though teachers belonged to professional associations, unions, as far as I understand, didn't play as much of a role. And so what was interesting, as I found out, is that term Bunkitsamunga, as much as it came from the teachers, they really adopted it from government mantras, and that the state was really dictating that this idea of raise the spirits and work collectively to build back better after the quake was actually a government imperative more so than something that came from unions or otherwise.
Excellent. Thanks, Chris. That's very enriching, and I appreciate that question very much. There are a number of other questions about this piece in the Q&A. I wonder if Chris, you might be able to jot some thoughts down, or we can keep those until later, just so you know about this. Okay. All right, as I transition between documents. Next, we'll hear about the field note, Voices of Refugee Youth, Reflections on a Participatory Youth-Centered Study, presented by Rebecca Daltrey. Rebecca is a researcher at JEiE, currently located in the UK, I believe in Edinburgh. Rebecca, please go ahead.
Thanks, Nate. It's great to be here. A joy to share briefly about our article today. And I've been loving hearing the contributions of the other authors so far. So as the title suggests, our article reflects on the participatory youth-centered approach adopted by Voices of Refugee Youth. This was a 4-year research initiative, which was conducted by Jigsaw, who I represent, and Refugee Education UK in partnership with UNHCR. And the initiative had 2 key objectives. The first, to build the evidence base for post-primary refugee education, was achieved through a longitudinal study with over 1,000 secondary and higher education refugee students in Pakistan and in Rwanda, so Afghan refugees in Pakistan and Congolese and Burundian refugees in Rwanda. And the second objective, which was to increase young refugees' access to and representation in refugee education research, was achieved through recruiting 31 youth researchers, all refugees themselves, recent graduates, also in Pakistan and Rwanda, who participated throughout the research and alongside it undertook an accredited training course, which was developed as part of the initiative in applied research. I should say that I am representing a large authorship team, including 4 of the youth researchers. This article itself was part of that second objective to increase the number of refugee voices in academic spaces, which are focused on refugee education. I think I can see a few of the youth researchers are on the call today, which is fantastic and a wonderful opportunity for me to publicly thank them for everything, all their contributions to this initiative. It was a big team effort. Next slide, please. So the article itself gives a critical reflection of the participatory approach of the research initiative and seeks to offer lessons for other such initiatives. It outlines the process through which the participatory design was created, recognising the challenges that presented, including involving refugee youth from the very outset of the study. At that point of, securing funding, securing the design, and making sure that refugee youth were participating in those conversations as far as possible, but the challenges associated with that, but also highlighting ways through which the approach to recruitment, remuneration, and training could facilitate that process of participation. The article then reflects on different stages of the research study, including the design, data collection, analysis, and dissemination, and the benefits and limitations and learnings from this process. In particular, and I've put this on the slide, the article refers to an adapted form of Hart's ladder of participation, which provides a framework for reflecting on different degrees of youth participation in relation to decision-making, agency, control, and power. And using this framework highlighted to us that participation may look different at different stages of the research process. For instance, we found it easier to facilitate and achieve higher levels of participation during data collection than analysis, particularly due to the nature of the very large data set, and explored a variety of different approaches to facilitate participation in the dissemination of findings. In this article itself being one form, others being youth advocacy reports, blogs, a whole range of different outputs. And that's one of the key conclusions of the article, really, that a flexible approach is vital when designing participatory research approaches.
Sorry, have we lost you, Rebecca? Rebecca, are you able to hear me? Just give her a few moments to come back. Thanks, Kelly. I see that she's frozen for you as well. Apologies for these technical delays.
Hi, Nate. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, hi, Rebecca.
I have no idea what happened there. It hopped off the call.
I'm sorry.
Apologies.
Please go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just saying I was wrapping up and saying that I'd love to engage with anyone thinking about these different approaches to participation, to share learnings and ideas. And I'd love to point you to our website, which I think is at the bottom of that slide. For more resources, we've developed a participatory toolkit off the back of this article, and also the various research reports which share the findings of the study itself. So apologies for the technical difficulties, but I hope that sparks some ideas and I'd love to continue the conversation.
Yeah, I really do hope that cross-pollination can happen for you based on this work. It's super great to have those tools to invite and support youth refugee researchers. And I really also appreciate how the refugee researchers were involved in the reporting and dissemination of your findings and promoting the work that you've done, including through this event and writing the field note. I'm sure other questions will come in through the chat for you to address. I wonder if you could Here's one, I believe, from Nishta Shrestha. What are some challenges faced by the refugee youths to participate?
Mhm. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, a range, and looks different in different. It looked different at different stages in the study, considering this was a 4-year longitudinal study, different in the different countries. I think one particular one which we navigated and thought a lot about throughout the training process was thinking about the dual benefits, but also challenges of conducting research alongside your peers, learning not to put bias into the way in which you're asking questions or assuming answers that you might be getting. So kind of navigating the ethical challenges of that, and particularly going and conducting research in schools where there are power dynamics. Some of our youth researchers were struggling with occasionally being turned away or kind of facing challenges from some head teachers, etc., because of their peer status with those they were conducting research with. Obviously, recognizing the consent and the permissions that were needed from those head teachers, but also I think that power dynamic was there, which maybe it wouldn't have been with external researchers. And so there were a whole range of kind of benefits and challenges associated with that, which we were particularly navigating with them.
Yeah, excellent. That is such a opportunities and pitfalls. Everyone should go and read this piece. I'm really excited about this one, and all of them, of course. Thank you again, Rebecca. Next, presenting the field note impact. Excuse me. Presenting the field note, the impact of COVID-19 on connected learning, unveiling the potential and the limits of distant education in Dadaab refugee camp, is Mirko Stella. Mirko is a doctoral candidate and a graduate research fellow at York University, currently located in Canada. Mirko, please go ahead.
Thank you, Nathan, and good day to everyone. So can you hear me? The audio is good, right? Okay, just wanted to double check. I mean, I will not go through the whole article, obviously. The article is there to speak for itself. I just wanted to add a few considerations to the article and as you read, I guess, the article. So the first thing I will say to introduce it is that it represents a sustained effort, I think, to learn together and to learn together from different perspectives and to think with these different perspectives. And so to explore basically this event, in a sense, of the pandemic on basically a program that has existed for over 10 years, delivering basically undergraduate and graduate programming to the camps in Dadaab. So through a consortium of universities and a partnership that is known as BEAR, so the Borderless Higher Education for Refugees project. So the three authors, myself included, obviously. We are myself, a longstanding course director in the project, Hayun, who is not here today, unfortunately, who extended the invite to work together on this article and who was a longstanding administrator in the project, and Kastahun, who is here today, and I hope will add his own input, perhaps maybe in the Q&A section, especially if possible, who was both a graduate student, an undergraduate student in the project, and as well as a peer mentor in the project. The other consideration I would like to add, so apart from this weaving of different perspectives together, which also, I mean, I think echoes Chris Henderson's point about bringing in different voices, the voices of teachers, the voices of students as well as those of the administrators. The second point I would like to bring into the conversation is the framing that informed, obviously, this piece, which is both critical and ambivalent, I would call it. We were conscious of what had been lost in the pandemic, I think, after working for 10 years in this context, through a commitment mostly to a blended educational model. Blended meaning it involved basically both online courses as well as face-to-face intensive sessions in Dadaab. And so with the pandemic, those aspects, so the learning center that held these intensive sessions, as well as provided a space for the students to always come together, was lost because of obviously the restrictions in the camps, as well as the staffing that was shorthanded during the pandemic, and a lot of the staff left. as well as the actual travel. International travel is required to obviously support the programming, right, during the pandemic. So the loss of all of these. So we were obviously very concerned with what happened. Because of that, we wanted to reflect critically together a little bit more of what these losses were. And then as well as we were also wanting to think more closely about what surprised us. So what came out, creativity, collaborations, new collaborations, local professional development, new forms of investment. And I don't mean financial investment, but also financial investment, but mostly also new forms of investment. I think I'm referring here to what Dana's point was about maybe new commitments, new forms of commitments from the teachers involved. The last consideration I will make is that, as is evident from the title, I think, we are obviously very aware that there is a difference between learning and education. And we're trying to think about a little bit more about what that means, right? So we're thinking a lot along the lines that Gary Piesta's work here on the philosophy of education and the purposes of an education in context of emergencies. If I could, yes, thank you. Next slide, please. And so I think ultimately what emerges from the work is this idea of thinking about education more as an encounter, right? As an encounter in reintroducing this aspect of relationality and the importance it played and in making possible even those surprising aspects that we didn't expect emerging from a pandemic. So, but we do want to tease that out, begin teasing that out, these aspects, these immaterial, intangible aspects, basically, of an encounter, a relationship, which I think Piesta sums up very wonderfully through the idea of this beautiful risk that can come out of these spaces, in these spaces where we come together, students, administrators, teachers, basically to work, or even if for an intensive, a brief amount of time. And so we are left with a question in a sense. And I think this question is mostly this idea of what is lost when we construct these sort of learning spaces as just spaces of emergency learning. And so in not speaking about it as spaces of education. And mostly, so what is the political vision, basically, behind these forms of education? What is this? What are we learning for, in a sense, to use this question? And how these spaces along the line have provided a way to think in dialogue with, as some of you already mentioned, the aspirations and voices, obviously, basically all the students themselves. And what does that mean for a teacher to be working alongside and in dialogue with these aspirations? And so what has been lost in a sense through the pandemic because of this lack of moments of being able to come together, but also what has been gained in terms of, as I said, creative collaborations. I think I'll leave it there. And then I'm more than happy to hear questions, actually, and then respond with more detail, perhaps, to any questions emerging from panelists. And as well as I will leave maybe, I don't know how much time we are at, Nathan, but if Kathleen wanted to mention something, he can perhaps as well, if he wants to add anything else.
Great. How about I suggest I'll throw a question out in the meantime.
Go for it, Nathan.
While we're waiting for other questions to come in through the chat. And it can be open to you, Mirko, or to Kasun. But if you or Kasun want to speak to something else, then go ahead and just go that route as well. Especially if Kasun would like to make some more points. I think what the borderless higher education for refugees program had that maybe a lot of other program implementations didn't heading into the pandemic was 7 years of institutional experience. So what does that sort of quite long history, if we're thinking in terms of EIE, that's actually sort of ages, what did that sort of institutionalization and history bring that helped it to be more agile or nimble as the pandemic settled in?
Thank you for that question, Nathan. And Kasaun, if you would like to, I'll start it and then I'll let Kasaun maybe intervene. I think what it had is, and I think this is what the point I was trying to make is that it had a long history of people working together. And what I mean by that is local NGOs, that like staff from local NGOs who knew the teachers, who knew the administrators from this side. It had collaborations that spanned not only locally, but also internationally. And I think all of this knowledge, all of these relationships that developed over time allowed it to be able to respond in a sense in a very successful way, because it was a very successful response. I mean, we've heard a lot of the shock of the pandemic, right? So students dropping, a lot of losses, but in the case for Bear, for example, 100% of retention was maintained. For the graduate students, 96% of completion rate for the undergraduate students. So we had very few cases of shock in that sense. We managed to retain students. Students did well through the program. However, again, it was more of I think this was achieved because of, like you said, Nathan, because of these 7 years. So this, I think what we're trying to really spotlight, and thank you for that question, it's the time and the space, basically, that is required to build a successful project, I think, that can even withstand emergency situations such as a pandemic, or increased emergency situations such as a pandemic. So those are the kinds of structures that were already in place, I think.
Great. And I don't know. Yeah, go ahead.
You have another one. You have another question, Nathan.
No, I wanted to invite Kasihun to provide a comment, but briefly, if possible.
I think thank you for giving me this opportunity. All I can say is, the learning environment in the DAB was unique, simply because you see the DAB in itself is a small town. It is a small Kenyan town located in arid and semi-arid areas, 90 kilometers west of the Somali border. But when it comes to the refugee camps, the 3 refugee camps that make up the Dadaab refugee complex were located in the radius of the Dadaab town. For instance, Ifo and the Dagahale are located in north of the Dadaab, 4 and 15 kilometers respectively, while Agadera located in the southeast of the Dadaab, approximately 11 kilometers. So the learning center was based in the Dadaab town. So coming to the learning center itself it requires a lot of commitment, because majority of the students there were teachers themselves in their respective camps. So they had to attend to their classes in the morning. They also had to travel all the way to the Dadaab town to attend to the learning centers. The environment is also very harsh. It is extremely hot in some months. So the rainy season is also very challenging. So in some scenarios, we had to travel on foot, right from our camps all the way to Dadaab. That was also an experience. So the closure of the learning center due to COVID-19 was in fact a big blow for those of us who had studied there. I myself was a graduate student at that time and also a peer mentor for the undergraduate students. But despite the many challenges, we had managed to complete the program. And that is all I can say for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kasihun and Mirko. I should have said that this is the first presentation today, and the final 2 presentations coming are those in the special subsection we had in our recent issue on education and pandemics. So these are field notes specifically about adaptations and considerations for that lockdown context. Next, presenting her field note, a capabilities response to the design and delivery of distance learning for the most educationally marginalized children during COVID-19. We'll hear from Kate Sykes. Kate is the International Program Manager at Link Education International. She's currently located in Edinburgh. The floor is yours, Kate.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. So this field note discusses the adaptations that were made by the TEAM project in Malawi in response to the emergency of the COVID-19 pandemic, and considers the lessons which can be drawn from taking a capabilities approach to distance education, both during emergencies and during normal times. The TEAM project provides complementary basic education to adolescents who have been left behind by the mainstream education system. Its students are primarily girls who face multiple intersecting barriers to learning, including disability, child marriage, motherhood, poverty, and harmful gender norms. So drawing on Amartya Sen's capability approach to human welfare, the TEAM project aims to provide its students with the capabilities needed to achieve the functioning of being educated. And following Sophie Mitra, the project uses a capability framework to consider how learners' individual characteristics, available resources, and lived environment interact to enable or constrain their learning. So before COVID-19, this meant delivering Malawi's complementary basic education curriculum in classes which were held at places and times to fit around the learner's family and work responsibilities, a low student-teacher ratio, and teachers trained in inclusive pedagogy. When the COVID-19 pandemic took hold in 2020, all schools, including our complementary basic education centres, were closed for several months. Our students experienced increased poverty and food insecurity, pressure to get married, risk of pregnancy, vulnerability to abuse, and negative effects on their mental health, all of which impacted their ability to continue attending classes and focus on their learning. Next slide, please. The government of Malawi's distance learning response focused on broadcasting lessons on the radio. This relied on students having access to radio technology and to taking the initiative to listen in with no or minimal structured support from their teachers. In contrast, using a capabilities framework, Team's distance learning response adapted a paper-based learning materials for self-guided study, which was then supported by face-to-face teaching in small socially distanced groups with masks and extra sanitation. The small group sessions started with activities to support learners' resilience during times of stress, and teachers continued to employ an inclusive education pedagogy where they are problem solvers who address the multiple barriers that are faced by their students. In addition, teachers became the main point of contact and support for learners with child protection concerns, following up at home when learners were absent and advocating for their learners. As a result, our students' access to learning remained stable, and over 80% of students recorded learning improvements in core subjects. In conclusion, for the most marginalised learners, face-to-face teaching delivered in a safe way is the only method that guarantees their continued learning during a pandemic. The key lesson is to invest in teachers rather than technology to reach the most marginalised. Thanks for listening, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you so much, Kate. As we're waiting for more questions to come in, I have one. Although other presenters or Dana or Sam, feel free to type a question in the chat. How did the educators in Malawi respond to what appears to be an increased role in the lives of their students and their communities, child protection, community engagement? Were these things they were ready to take on, or was there any sort of training, or what was their reaction?
I think firstly, they were pleased to still be employed. A lot of people lost their jobs during the pandemic, and there was a lot of pressure on families and people in general economically. Harvests had to be delayed in many cases. So the fact that we continue to employ them as teachers was really welcomed. So they were very open then to discussing with us what kind of role they would be taking on. And I also think because they had been trained in this inclusive approach to education, and they were very in tune with their students from the beginning anyway, that they really understood the need to look at things from a really multifaceted perspective, even more so during the emergency. And the way we restructured their teaching, they taught less frequently, but did slightly different things, meant that we weren't really asking them to spend additional time, but just to use their time slightly differently.
Great, thank you, Kate. I've been trying to put all of the article links in the chat. I hope that folks are following those and reading the full text of the piece. Thanks again, Kate. We've come to our final panelist, presenting the field note, Preparing Children for an Unpredictable World in the Middle of a Crisis, La Aldea's Approach, is Emmanuel Neza. Emmanuel is the co-founder and CEO of ClickArte. He is currently based in Bogota, Colombia. Go ahead, Emmanuel.
Hi, everyone. So I wanted to talk to you about a very practical approach that we created for the COVID-19 educational emergency, but that lasted for other emergencies. So it incubated a solution that still works for other conflict emergencies, for natural hazard emergencies. So what I wanted to tell you is first, I mean, I will not spend a lot of time explaining what happened during COVID-19 and the school closures, because I think everyone here is acquainted with that. But to tell you that all this COVID-19 school emergency here in Colombia also joined the armed conflicts that we have in many rural areas. So school closures was something that was already happening in Colombia, and making those schools at home in a context in Colombia where poor people have overcrowded homes, where economic distress of family also brings socio-emotional crises, and where we have this context of violence, makes it very special for Colombia. Makes Colombia a very special case in the world. With that, we knew that less than 25% of teachers had received training for online teaching. 64 school principals considered available technology insufficient, and only 67% of 15-year-old students had internet access. So what we created is a solution, and what I want to bring to the table here is the importance of narratives to create solutions that can bridge the gaps in this kind of school closures, for example. So La Aldea, we created La Aldea, that is a fable universe in which animals that are archetypes of a Latin American society interact, and while they interact, we create metaphors of what is happening to them. So through those stories, through those narratives, we create school materials, we create out-of-class materials as well, and we create platforms for teachers and parents to talk about what is happening now. And through that, we create innovative solutions so that we can do math, we can do language, we can do foundational learning, we can do social-emotional learning through those stories and through the activities that are with them. So if you want to change the slide, thank you. So this multifaceted approach, so while creating this narrative that is graphic, that is radio-wise, that can be printed. So what we did is we created all those stories, and we created books, radio, digital content, songs, games. And through all that, we could reach every single child that we implemented. We had 87 and 667 families that were reached with this program, some with radio, some with the books, some with the games. We also we did not discriminate between children that were in school and that were out of school. So we worked with migrants as well. And what we did is, as we embedded everything that needed to be taught, like for the Colombian school system, for the Ministry of Education, so teachers did have a complete material through which they can communicate with students. So this material came with types of lessons that they could teach remotely, and as the whole universe was perceived as a game, autonomous learning happened a lot. Families could open up those conversations. And what we found really interesting is that as these stories were metaphors of real life situations, kids and parents could talk about what was really happening to them at this time. So when we embedded maths, for example, we embedded about how did the virus in La Aldea spread in the ant colony. And so we did linear and exponential growth. We talked about linear versus exponential growth through that universe of La Aldea. But when we were looking at the TV and seeing what was happening there, we could understand how that curve was created. And to finalize is as this universe kept growing, we made more than 40 stories, we made more than 10 books, we made more than 40 radio shows. This allowed us to gather other allies. So UNICEF took it as its strategy for COVID, but also for their after COVID program. The Norwegian Refugee Council, the Lego Foundation financed a whole radio program for the whole region here with the IRC. So this was a universe that was created here during the pandemic, and that allowed us to have a very easy to deploy universe for any kind of emergency, and that we are still using now in El Salvador, in Honduras, in Colombia, and yeah, that's it.
Thanks, Emmanuel. I'm just reading in the chat. Thanks. I think that's a response to a different question from Kate. So Emmanuel, just briefly, the extent of the scale up and the distribution of the resources into different contexts in Central America and in South America is quite impressive. How did you get the buy-in from the ministries of education and the government actors? How did you have such a successful scale up?
I feel that a lot of education systems are struggling with how to get attention from the parents, from the kids, from the teachers, and how to, and this question about making it fun, making it pertinent, making it in dialogue with the context that we are living, that makes La Aldea a very likable strategy. Because behind that, we are not struggling and we're not fighting with educational models in every country. La Aldea is as flexible as we want, so we can accommodate that model to the different types of strategies that ministries have, that international organizations have. So we made a very flexible universe in which we enter through stories, but then we gather everything that the organizations that are contracting these needs. So I think that's the flexibility of it, and the design, the aesthetics. I feel that when people have La Aldea materials in their hands, or they hear it in the radio, the craft makes something that is very emotional there, and we take ministers of education, director of international agencies, they see it, and they would do it for their kids, because many times people take decisions for the kids of the other that they wouldn't take for theirs. And here they say, I want my kid to do this, and so there is something about that.
Thanks, Emmanuel. And again, congratulations on the success of La Aldea. It's a really interesting model, and the resources are beautiful. The images here of the shows and the books is really interesting. So since we're sort of close to our time for today's webinar, I don't think that we're going to have time to go back to a full plenary Q&A session. Unfortunately, although we've taken meticulous notes on the questions that were posted in the chat and in the QA box, there's a couple remaining. Hopefully get you some answers for those in the meantime. But to take things home, I just want to pass it back to JEiE Editor-in-Chief Dana Birdie.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nate. And thank you, everyone. That was fascinating to listen to all these presentations in one go. And I'm so excited for our launch of this new issue. Let me just provide a few observations, and I'll sprinkle in a couple of questions for presenters, but not to discuss now, maybe to think about as we go forward. But one point that strikes me across all of the presentations and all of the papers is how close the pandemic has brought us as educators together. I find that really interesting to think about all the ways in which we're in conversation around the world. I mean, these examples that we've been discussing today extend across the globe, really almost every corner of the globe. So I think in some ways that's exciting to see that collaboration and that increased focus on collaboration among so many different practitioners and academics and policymakers. I'm going to comment really briefly on each paper, in the order in which they were delivered. So starting with Catch-Up Club, Sylvia's presentation, I found it really interesting to think about this quasi-experimental impact evaluation Particularly, I was interested in some of the questions that were raised by the audience as well. I was particularly interested in the use of language and local language and the importance of local language in this study. I would love to hear more about it. How does this also compare to other interventions? Save the Children obviously works in many countries around the world. So again, not to be answered right now, but a question to think about more deeply, I think, going forward. Rena's paper with Hedy Laman on, and I'm sorry, I'm not mentioning all of the co-authors. There are many that are not present with us today. On gender responsive social and emotional learning, thinking about these differences that were uncovered in this systematic review, the differences and effects that are so important for us to understand better, the effects that relate to gender and age, and thinking more deeply about what happens with social and emotional interventions for older children. Why are those effects less positive in some cases and even maybe a negative in some cases, right? I think that needs to be explored a little bit more deeply. Gudrun's paper on the effects of school closures and dropout rates, school closures on dropout rates for Rohingya refugees in Cox's Bazar. This I also found really interesting to think about in terms of differences, specifically the effect on teenage girls in this context among Rohingya refugees, and the effects that we see among boys in many other contexts. So these gender, I again would be curious in comparison how this refugee population differs from others. And maybe you don't have that data, Gudrun, but interesting for future research, perhaps. Hassan, thank you so much. Those questions about youth aspirations and hope are near and dear to my heart. I've done, as you may know, with Elizabeth King, we conducted a study on hope among Kenyan youth and in Nairobi and youth in Karachi, Pakistan, and found very similar results in our qualitative data collection. This extreme, these sometimes extreme experiences with education that produce dashed hopes. I was encouraged by your mentioning your findings that although you identified these two extremes, that you didn't see that didn't emerge as the norm. And also very encouraging and interesting to think about education as a cultural belief. What does that really mean? I think that's also a question for more qualitative research down the line. Chris, thank you so much for your discussion of the distinction between teaching and teachers, and the absence of focus on teachers with so much focus on teaching. Really important to consider that that gap in the information that we have available to us, and important to think about what teachers bring to their teaching, not thinking of people affected by conflict and crisis as victims, but of course as agents. This is also, I think, a disconnect between those who live in peaceful societies. I realize we're out of time, and I'm talking about every single paper, so I know that INE has very strict time limits, so I'm just going to wrap up with our field notes. Terrific emphasis on COVID-19 and learning possibilities. Very exciting to see the potential and the limits, and the emphasis on in-person as an important addition, various creative ways of connecting people in person to distance learning programs. I'll leave it there. Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you to our editorial team. Thank you so much, Nate, for leading us through these terrific papers. And thanks to INE.
Thanks, Dana, and thanks to all the presenters again. We'll make sure a recording of this webinar is available publicly to share. Okay, thanks all. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.